This is part 1 of ASP.NET Web Services. In this video, we'll discuss creating a simple ASP.NET Web Service. We'll also discuss the technologies that are used with ASP.NET Web Services. But please note that these ASP.NET ASMX Web Services are a legacy technology. Most of the companies are now using WCF, that is Windows Communication Foundation, to build XML Web Services and XML Web Service clients. However, this course will be useful for those who are searching for a job as a .NET developer, as there are some companies still using ASMX Web Services today, and an interviewer could ask interview questions related to them. In our upcoming WCF video series, we will discuss building XML web services and clients using WCF. So, what are web services and why should we use them? Web services are a standardized way for developing interoperable applications, that is, enabling an application to invoke a method of another application. These applications can either be on the same computer or on different computers. As long as they are connected by a network, web services enable these applications to communicate with each other. Web services use open standards and protocols like HTTP, XML, and SOAP. Since these are open and well-known protocols, applications built on any platform can interoperate with web services. For example, a Java application can interoperate with a web service built using .NET. Similarly, a web service built using Java can be consumed by a .NET application. Let's now look at building an ASP.NET web service. Let's flip to Visual Studio. Click on File, New Project. Let's create an empty ASP.NET web application. Let's call this Web Services Demo. Click OK. So this should add an empty ASP.NET web application project. To this project, let's add a web service. And to do that, right-click on the project name, Add New Item. Make sure you have Web selected under Installed Templates, and then if you scroll all the way down, you should find Web Service there. But if you have large number of templates here, instead of manually looking for web service, you can also use the search feature. So simply type web service and the search feature should bring it up for you. So select web service and notice the extension of web service. It's .asmx, and for this reason these are also called as ASMX web services. And let's call our web service Calculator Web Service. Click Add. So basically, as part of this web service, we are going to expose a method which is going to take two numbers, add them together, and then return their sum. But before we do that, let's examine the code that is auto-generated for us. Now, the web service that we have added is actually a class. Look at this Calculator Web Service. It's nothing but a class. But this class is decorated with web service attribute. Basically, this attribute tells that this class contains web service code. And look at this web service attribute has got this namespace property. So what are these web service namespaces? Basically, these namespaces are used to uniquely identify your web service from the other web services that are already there on the web. For example, now we have this Calculator Web Service. Now after we have done building this, we publish it on the internet. Now let's say, for example, there is another person who has developed a web service with the same name, Calculator Web Service. So basically, to uniquely identify your web service from the other web services that are already there on the web, we use this namespace property. Basically, this namespace, look at the IntelliSense, it's actually a string, meaning you can set it to any string, but it is common for the namespace to be, something like a company internet domain name, something like, for example, prajimtech.com. And if you want, you can give something like web services. So prajimtech.com web services. Now this namespace is going to ensure that our web service is uniquely identified. Okay, so a web service is decorated this with this web service attribute. And if you look at here, the web service class is also inheriting from this class, that is system.web.services.web service class. Now, is it mandatory for a web service to inherit from that class? Not really. But if at all, if the web service has to use something like ASP.NET Session State or Application State objects, then in order for the web service to have direct access to those objects, we make it inherit from that web service class. Alright, and if you look at this web service, it has got one method, hello world. And if you look at this method, it is decorated with web method attribute. So what is this attribute? Basically, if you want to expose a method as part of the web service to a client, that is a calling application, then that method needs to be decorated with web method attribute. If you don't decorate it with web method attribute, then the client application cannot see that method. So if you want your method to be exposed to a client, then that method needs to be decorated with web method attribute, and that method needs to be public as well. Okay, now instead of this method, and another thing, this attribute has got several properties like buffer response, cache duration, description, etc. Now these properties of this attribute are basically used to customize the behavior of your web service. We'll discuss these properties in detail in our upcoming video session, but for now understand that if at all if you want to expose a method as part of your web service, then that method needs to be decorated with web method attribute. But let's change the return type of this method to integer, and let's call this method as add, and let's pass two parameters to this function. Let's call the first one as first number and the second parameter as second number. And all we want to do is add those two numbers together and return their sum. So first number plus second number. Alright, so at this point we have a working web service. Let's build that. And notice that within the solution, status bar, you can see build succeeded. Now to run the web service, you can simply run it by pressing Ctrl F5, or you can right click on the web service name in the Solution Explorer and then select this option, View in Browser. So look at this. We are invoking the calculator web service that we have just created. Now I'm using Google Chrome here, so that's the reason why you can't see the protocol that we are using. But then if you copy the URL and paste it within the notepad, look at that, we are using HTTP protocol. And in order to access a web application, we use HTTP protocol. In a similar fashion, to access web services, we use HTTP protocol. So basically, Hypertext Transfer Protocol is the protocol widely used by web services to send and receive messages. Web services can also use other protocols like SMTP, but the most widely used protocol is HTTP. And the messaging protocol is SOAP. SOAP stands for Simple Object Access Protocol. SOAP messages are in XML format. In a bit we will see how a SOAP request and response message look like. And we have already seen that web services have .asmx extension, and for this reason web services are also often called as ASMX web services. Now, so this is the web service page. And look at this here, I have a link called service description. Now if I click on this link, look at that, within the URL it says WSDL. WSDL stands for Web Service Description Language. We'll discuss in detail about this WSDL document in our upcoming video session, where we will discuss how to consume this web service from a client application like an ASP.NET web application or a Windows application. Basically, this WSDL document is used by the clients to generate the proxy classes. However, we'll talk in detail about this one in a later video session. But for now, understand that when we click on this service description link, it takes us to that WSDL page. And notice here we have that method add, and if you recollect, we have decorated the method with web method attribute. Now what's going to happen if we get rid of that attribute, and then if we run this web service, let's look at what's going to happen. look at that, we don't see that add method. So that's why if you want to expose your method as part of that web service, then decorate it with web method attribute. Now, when we click on this add method, look at that, it takes us to a page where we can test our web service method. So look at this, the parameters first number and second number. Let's pass, for example, 10 and 20 and click on this invoke button. Look at that, we get a result of 30. Now, apart from having an interface to test the web service method on this page, you also have the sample request and response SOAP messages. Look at this. First of all, this is the request message here. So if you look at this message, it's in XML format. So basically this is an XML format, but it is formatted according to the SOAP protocol, that is Simple Object Access Protocol. So SOAP specification states that there needs to be a SOAP envelope, and within SOAP envelope there will be a SOAP header and a SOAP body. Since we are not using SOAP headers, it's not displayed here, but look at that, there's a SOAP body here, and this body contains first number and second number. Okay, those are the parameters of our add method. And then if you look at the response message, what are we going to get back? We are going to get an integer back, which is nothing but the sum of those two numbers. Again, look at that, within the response we have a SOAP envelope and a SOAP body, and the response of that add method is present here as an integer. Okay, so basically this is how a SOAP request and response message looks like. Now for an application to invoke the add method, the application should create a SOAP request message like this and then invoke the web service method. And then the web service is going to send response in this format, so the client application has to parse that and then use it in the way it has to. But do we really have to manually generate these SOAP request and response messages? Not really. We will develop proxy classes which is going to do all the hard work for us. We'll discuss that is consuming a web service from a client application, in our next video session. And if you look at these SOAP messages here, there are two versions, that is SOAP 1.1 and SOAP 1.2. So what are these two versions? Basically SOAP 1.2 is a later version, and obviously there are several changes from SOAP 1.1. If you want to look at the detailed differences between SOAP 1.1 and 1.2, I have a URL here. So basically visit this URL. Alright, so let's quickly go over these points. So we discussed that a web service is a class that is decorated with web service attribute, and it also can inherit from a base class, that is system.web.services.web service base class. The web service attribute tells that this class contains the code for web service. Web service namespace is used to uniquely identify your web service on the internet from other services that are already there on the web. Web service namespace can be any string, but it is common to give it a company's internet domain name, as they are usually unique, something like pragimtech.com/webservices. It's not mandatory for a web service class to inherit from system.web.services.web service base class. However, if the web service has to use ASP.NET Session or application state objects, then inheriting from that base class will provide direct access to those ASP.NET objects. To allow a web service to be called from JavaScript, now if you look at the commented out code here, look at that, this line is commented, basically this attribute system.web.script.services.script service. Now if you want this web service to be callable from JavaScript, using ASP.NET Ajax, then that web service needs to be decorated with that attribute. There's a comment as well here that states it. In our upcoming video session, we'll see how to invoke a web service using ASP.NET Ajax. And if you want a method to be exposed as part of the web service, then the method must be public and it should be decorated with web method attribute. This attribute has got several properties which can be used to configure the behavior of the XML web service method. Alright, so in our next video we'll discuss consuming this web service from a client application, that is from an ASP.NET Web application. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.